Probably one of the most common methods of sewing down your binding is to stitch in the ditch, which is what we had done before. So I'm just going to line up my needle at the edge of my binding, and again I'm sewing from the front of the quilt. And so I'm just going to start sewing, and I'm sewing very carefully along that edge. I'm trying to avoid sewing on the binding, but just to stay in the quilt. So I have matching thread for the quilt. However, if you want to have a contrasting thread, that's entirely your decision. So from the front, it's very tidy, and on the back, this is what you're going to see. It's going to show up on your binding at the back. So here again, a choice can be made to have either a contrasting thread for the binding in the back, or to use a different color for the binding for the back if need be. Another method of sewing down your binding from the front side, that's wrong. A common stitch to use when sewing down your binding is the blanket stitch, and I have mine set at 3.5 for the width and 4.5 for the length. And I've already mitered my corners, and I've glued them down in place just to hold them in place. So I'm going to now get my needle right in the corner, and I'm going to start sewing, and I'm going to follow this line right along the edge of the binding. And I want to have the edge of that stitching right at the edge of the binding. So that might take a bit of practice to keep that going. And this is what it looks like on the front of the quilt, and this is what it's going to look like on the back of the quilt, because remember, when your binding got flipped, it was a little bit wider in the back than in the front. If I were to stitch this same pattern on the back of the binding, it looks very tidy, but what shows up on the front is this, which is not very pleasant. Another option is this little snowflake pattern, and I have to make sure that I keep the needle just onto the left of the binding, so that it's not stitching that's running stitch onto the green part of the binding. And you also have to remember that when you're doing these kinds of stitches, the needle has to punch through quite a few layers of fabric, so you may find that you have to slow the machine down a bit to give it a chance to get through all those layers. And also you'll probably find that very often it's going to be stitching quite a double stitching, so the length of time that it's going to take to get the stitching done obviously is going to be a bit longer. Another option is to sew a pattern right on the binding itself, and you can see from here that my binding is the width of these two red marks on my foot, which is about 10 millimeters. So when you're choosing your pattern, you don't want to obviously go anything beyond that, beyond 10 millimeters. And again, you're still stitching through quite a few layers, so you're going to be careful to give the machine time to punch through everything. And I'm going to make sure that I'm keeping my binding running between those two lines, so I have it stitching right on top of the binding. And so this is what it's going to look like on the front. And on the back, oh, I guess I didn't catch my thread properly. On the back it's going to look like that with the edge of the binding showing as well.